Welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one big idea, or in this case, chapter, at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hey, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Ready to dive into more sticky, contentious, Pauline argumentation today?
Oh, so ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A day that ends in day. Yeah. It's been a good journey so far. That last week with Micah was a blast. I so enjoyed their insights on this clobber passage as pairing with the work you brought with ample footnotes to what was
Which we
going
didn't
on.
even talk about all of them, but
Yeah.
of course we didn't talk about all of them. We didn't even talk about all the ones that I thought this might be good to talk about.
Yeah. For those of you who did not look through the translation, and I know through link tracking that almost all of you don't.
Oh.
I appreciate your trust with our voice. It goes down to footnote TTT. That means it went from A to Z, AA to ZZ, and AAA to Z to TTT.
Yeah, which is somewhere in the ballpark of 70 footnotes for that one chapter.
Yeah. There are not that many in chapter 2. We're just going down to we're going down
Only.
to PP.
Oh no.
I didn't plan that. I'm sorry. So it's the word of the Lord. We are going to continue on in Paul's argumentation here. Because that culmination of what he was going for in at the end of 1, we decided actually to read in to really conclude that in chapter 2, verse 1, because it starts with because of all that.
Right.
On it goes. You as an individual person are without excuse when you judge, and on it goes. So how would you summarize for folks who haven't had time to read through the whole thing, although we hope you will take time? Where's the argumentative flow from that stuff through the end of this chapter?
Yeah. So it's trying to point out like issues of faithfulness or unfaithfulness to the way of the Lord, with the way of Christ, are not an issue of this group or that group or this person or that person.
Yeah.
But that it's a struggle for everybody. And sorry, you froze there for a second.
So did you.
It's a struggle for yeah.
Hey,
It's
and
a
that's the
struggle for
point of
everybody.
this chapter. You deviated.
That's right.
So did you.
You did, and I did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically the Spider-Man meme.
Yeah, which isn't about making everyone feel ashamed of make sure you remember everyone's a turd.
Right.
It's more like you can't you can't stroke your ego, you can't be arrogant, you can't find your sense of value and belonging in being part of one group over another, because there's issues with all of them, right? And that becomes really the point of chapter 2, is like saying, okay, yeah, but it's not about being Jewish or being not Jewish. Neither of them is what makes you belong, even if it's these markers of like, oh well, Jews have Torah. Great. Do you practice it? If you don't have Torah, maybe you still practice it, because it's the doing that matters, not the having. And that's kind of the argument of this next chapter.
Like, great, you've got a moral code and a kind of sacred practices code. You know what that allows you to do now that other people don't have? Hypocrisy.
Mhm.
That's original sin. You've got a new one. Um, I'm riffing on Eddie Izzard there. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, that's
always a good idea.
yeah. Forgive me, Lord, I poked the badger with a spoon. Uh, that's original. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good summary of like I think what Paul is trying to get at here. And it's yeah. So let's walk through a few of these core translation changes. It turns out there's a whole lot of them that are consequential and fairly load bearing just in chapter 2 that we will go deep on some and fist bump a few of the others along the way. Um, that we'll spend more time in subsequent episodes. And some of them we've talked about in depth. We've dedicated entire episodes in previous seasons. So if you're curious for that, just look for some of those keywords as you browse through our episode list. Um, I want to start with the word you and your in
Hmm.
throughout this chapter because it's a different kind of you than is usually in the epistles. And it's really
Hmm.
different from what's in the rest of Romans.
Yeah, yeah. This chapter where it's normally y'all in most places. Anytime it's not 100%, but it's a pretty good bet. If you see the word you in an English translation of the Bible, um, if you assume that that's y'all, it's talking to the group as a whole group, that's a good bet. In this chapter, it changes that and it starts talking singular to each individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the impact of that for you, Brandon? Because I mean, that's something that's I just
Yeah.
it could just be like a nerdy like, ooh, that's fascinating.
I
But
think it, yeah.
yeah, it
Yeah.
seems like it might matter.
I think the church trajectory that we both found ourselves in our lives, drew ourselves to community life that really emphasizes a certain sense of aha. Um, to your point there, that like almost all the time of you, particularly like it's particularly consequential in Ephesians and some of those other like
Hmm.
prison epistles. We're so acclimated as uh, individualist Westerners to hear and reading the text is fundamentally about individual rule breaking is the problem, right?
Yeah. An individual going to heaven when you die is the
Yeah,
solution.
because
But
ultimately, what the hell is
right.
any of it about except heaven and hell? Goes the conventional reading of the sacred story, and therefore these passages. So when we read a lot of do this, you do that, both accusatory and imperative, we hear it to us as an individual. In fact, we're trained to read our Bible as my, not our, but my Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Mm-hmm.
And it's overwhelmingly addressing a community whose
Right.
life together is meant in some sense to incarnate Jesus, the individual, you might say. Um,
Mm.
but those passages get radically changed when you see y'all, the plural, the secondary plural or second person plural. Um, and so now I've been acclimated to almost always read a lot of these. Whenever I see you, assume it's a y'all, which is a really good bias because it is probably 90% of the time or more
Hmm.
in the Christian texts. In the case here, he's really trying to hone in on, and I'm curious why. Um, it's fairly telling that he's making this part of the argument.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, what occurs to me is that this chapter is explicitly about what group you're part of doesn't matter as far as whether you're considered righteous or unrighteous, sinful or not sinful. Like, it's not having a tribal badge, it's not having my member's card that matters. It's how you live that
yeah,
matters. And that's a different
thank you.
emphasis than in other places. It's very much like we're not talking about like, are you a good or bad person? It's how is the community being shaped? And of course,
Yes.
that involves individuals. The point is really much more of like, what kind of society are we building?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And that's just a different thing than what he's talking about here.
It is. And how do I say this? Because it's the question of like, on what grounds do you belong? That's the language that
Right,
we're
right.
addressing here, is on what grounds do you belong? Um, it turns out liberation, salvation in the old tongue, is fundamentally about belonging,
Mhm.
both socially and a sense of like union with God kind of belonging. Um, in the old way of hearing this argument in Romans 2, it's by what means are you saved? Are you going to heaven? Whatever. And the old way, the kind of particularly Protestant way of reading it is, uh, well, there's like you think you do good works, but you don't do good. It doesn't matter because that's not enough to save you, even if it says we're
Right.
all saved by our works. Uh, right there.
Or
Uh,
work out your liberation, perhaps. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, but it's actually really talking about like, on what grounds do you think you belong? Just because you're part of a
Right.
particular group doesn't mean you are default in. In fact, that sets you in some sense to a higher standard because it's giving you it
Right.
complicates your shit.
Yeah. You
It's a
have,
tremendous honor and it
there's
is a
a higher
burden.
level of accountability.
It's a higher level of accountability. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So really trying to lean in onto that question of like, on what grounds shall I belong? How then
Hmm.
shall we be saved? As they they ask. It's
Hmm.
it's so similar, but it's like we just like moved a few of the like core ideas around, and it takes on a much more consequential import.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and part of the consequential import really does center around the question of what is, well, I guess the old translations, looking at the very end of verse 3. Um, I'll just read verse 3. Do you imagine this, you person who judges those who practice things like these and who does them too, that you will escape God's verdict? Now, usually that's God's judgment.
Yeah. I should bring this up on the screen too.
Oh, goodness gracious me. Please do.
There we go.
Blessed art thou among Brandons, and the fruit of thy work. So thank you. Verse 3. Yeah, it's usually God's judgments. So the subtext of
Hmm.
the wrong way of telling the story, we think,
Yeah.
ah, is
Damn it.
there we go. Technical hiccups there. Is that we're being saved from God's like plan to punish everyone. Like, see, look, we're all kind of
Hmm.
turds. Therefore, on what grounds do you escape God flushing all the turds?
Right.
And there's a different sense here with verdict.
Yeah. Yeah. And even judgment is not the wrong word, but we use it so much to think of punishment. Um, but that's not, I mean, sentencing can be a judgment, but it has to do with a decision of some
Yes.
kind.
Yeah.
And so a judge's decision, particularly. But again, keeping in mind that a judge in the ancient world had a broader scope than judges or context of just doing legal trials all the time. Right? It was kind of a leader of a magistrate, someone who's governing as well as
Hmm.
making decisions about all cases and stuff too.
Yeah. Thank you.
So there's basically just whatever the decision a judge, government leader makes about something
Hmm.
is the broad meaning of this word. So trying to figure out in context what's the clearest way to bring that into English of what it's actually talking about in each space.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you pointing out that distinction that, like, it's not strictly a wrong word, but sometimes we have to just get a palate cleanser. And that is
Hmm.
a lot of the translation decisions you make are like, no, the other word isn't wrong, but because of the legacy of that word, or because it's, I
Right,
think we
right,
spoke much in some of the first couple seasons of religious technical terms.
right.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about like as a counselor, I would talk about my clinical judgment. Right. That doesn't mean the punishment giving to my clients, right? It's I'm trying to use the wisdom and knowledge that I have to make a decision about something regarding the treatment that I'm giving.
yes.
Uh, it's the same thing here. But like you said, as a religious technical word, judgment has become equated with punishment. Like Judgment Day is when everything is going to get left out. There's going to be lots of suffering. There's going to be lots of punishment meted out. Um,
Yeah.
it's it's the day of judgment is not the day of punishment. It's the day of when things are decided, when things are made to happen. As again, because it's not just a judge like in our context that's deciding guilty or not guilty, renting out a sentence. It's judges like in the book of Judges. They're leading the community, making decisions about the guide the community forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And having a vision more of restorative justice than punitive and carceral. Because yeah, it's not
Hmm.
about like on the day of the judgment of God, who's going to get punished and who isn't. That's not the question. The question is,
Right.
how will God make things right and who will belong in
Yep.
that right making world? And how do we relate to all of that? That's a
Yeah.
big, important question that sounds similar, but boy, is it different than which kid is God gonna beat?
You're right. Right. Yeah, and that again, the contrast of contexts in our context in the American justice system, it's
Yes.
it's just does this person deserve to be punished or not? That's the
Mm-hmm.
question of every criminal trial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, that is not the context of what justice means in the Bible. Justice in the Bible is that things are being made right, being made well, being made good for everyone involved.
Yes. Yes. And the question here is, how are we going to get in on that? And
Yes.
how does that final verdict live out in our present day and life?
Hmm.
Like N.T. Wright talks about, like the verdict of God being brought forward into the present. And that is kind of the question at heart here. And that brings us to uh, verse 4 and 5, the transformation of uh, Not understanding that God's kind character guides you toward the transformation of your mind. Verse 5, instead, based on your hardness and your heart that refuses to consider, you're accumulating
Reconsider.
anger at yourself on the day of God's anger and just verdict.
Hmm.
So usually there's like repentance and unrepentance language in there, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, what I have is the transformation of your mind is traditionally repentance. And then in verse 5, uh, refuses to reconsider is unrepentant, actually,
Hmm.
um, which we've talked about pretty at length in other places. The Greek word metanoia, the compound word meta referring to change, noia referring to mind. It's a change of your mind, a transformation of your mind, not not penitence, which ESV actually uses impenitent there. Um,
Vocab word.
the Latin in the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Greek Testament used penitere penit. I can't say it, but the word that where we get penitence
Uh-huh.
um, says that sense of remorse,
Hmm.
which is not what metanoia means. It's not mutually exclusive. You might experience some remorse when you're metanoiaing, but that's not what it means.
Yeah.
Uh, it's really about transforming your mind, not just like changing your mind, like, oh, I wanted to have Cheerios for breakfast, but I changed my mind and now I'm going to have eggs and toast. Like, it's a deeper transformation than that. It's changing how I think, how I perceive things, how I understand the world and how to live in it. And that takes time. That's not just I'm gonna like realize I did something wrong, cry about it a bit,
Yes.
pray that God forgives me, and now I'm good. That's not repentance. That's not metanoia. Metanoia takes probably years. Like it's this
It's a lifetime.
commitment to transforming, being willing to receive input and change how I understand things.
Yeah. And how I feel things, how I love and desire
Hmm.
things, what
What
I
I
give my
do
attention
based on
to.
how I, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like your translation there in 4, transformation of your mind, then in 5, and your heart that refuses to reconsider. And heart, we were talking before the episode, is not the locus of like feelings or
Right.
sentimentality. It can include that, but the word there in the old days really means the like locus or seat of desire and longing
Hmm.
and attention.
Yeah. The desires that then motivate you to act in certain ways.
Yes, yeah. So it's the totality of your interior life, both how you think, what you think about, and how you desire and what you desire. Um,
Hmm.
those are that's very encompassing. It's not cerebral, it's not this cerebral disembodied sense of repentance where or transformation of your mind or reconsidering. It's not like, oh, I hadn't thought of these new metaphysical postulations
Hmm.
or new rules to follow, but it's a much more encompassing,
Yeah.
full-bodied, heartfelt
Right.
path.
Yeah.
Uh, and
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 almost entirely what it's talking about throughout the Bible is transforming from the emotions and motivations for self-preservation to prioritize my own needs over and above other people's,
yes,
often leading to violence, to fraud, to manipulation, to whatever it takes to look out for number one.
yeah,
Um, I don't care who I step on along the way. or maybe it's not even just about me individually, but even about my group over and above another group. Right?
Yeah.
Um, and transforming that into the way of Christ, that cruciformity of everyone is my group. And the way that we take care of each other is by prioritizing loving kindness, active helping each other. And if we're all doing that, then we're creating a world where everyone's needs are met. And I don't have to worry about self-preservation anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you refuse to consider that because you're hard there, like not just stubborn, which is how most of the stubbornness is how most of the translations translate that word. But it's much more like being callous, being numb to feeling for others, being not is incompassionate a word? Not compassionate, the opposite of compassion, anti-compassionate,
Yeah.
um, harsh, unfeeling. That's what this word means.
And I want to say that we bring this up for a handful of reasons. One of which is, hey, this is a podcast where we're geeking out pretty hard about original languages and a lot of philosophical, bigger. That we're exploring reality in that key.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, from our neck up. Like with our, it's
Sure.
a very heady kind of conversation we can have. Um, and it's important to acknowledge this is actually not the best way to transform people. This is an
Right.
important component of that. It's a full-bodied formation together to how to see the world and engage the world and love the world more than ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. To speak to that, I guess the goal in this project is not so much to transform people, but to remove barriers to their transformation.
thank you. Yes.
It's like if we're taught over and over again that thinking in these ways is against God's will,
Yeah.
then we're gonna fight it. Not because we're trying to be unfeeling, but because we think it's bad. But I'm trying to show here that actually it's different maybe than what we've been handed, and there's actually a lot more room for following our intuitions and allowing experiences of love to transform us, that we don't have to fight against where that naturally would take us.
Yeah. Yeah. Another layer to this is to acknowledge the fact that we, as dudes in the West, particularly
Mm-hmm.
spending time in evangelical circles in our earlier years, were given a script for masculinity and gender difference, where
Mm-hmm.
men are taught not to feel or to love, like to not be in touch with desire, particularly, or feeling more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the work of resisting um, patriarchy and replacing it with something healthier is a more fully hearted, fully human thing that we're trying to transform our minds, find our minds transformed by, and really
Mm-hmm.
reconsidering like, wait, what happens if I sit with that feeling and find more and more specific ways to describe what I'm feeling, whether that's in my body or what we might think of as more in our mind. However
Yeah.
distinct we can make those. So this conversation is fundamentally an anti-patriarchal one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think of, as a counselor, I tell this to my clients often, that when there's no such thing as not having feelings about things. That's just not how brains and bodies work.
Yeah.
Emotion is at the foundation of every experience we have, including what we think is worth paying attention to when we're trying to be rational thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so any appearance of, oh, I'm not letting emotion into my decisions or how I understand things is just you're being tricked, basically.
Yeah.
Uh, the image that I use is that emotions are always there and they will always pull the strings, always. And if you're just not if you have trained yourself to not be aware of your emotions, they're pulling your strings from behind a curtain and you don't realize it, but it's still happening. If you can pull back the curtain, learn to become familiar with your emotions and how they're influencing you, then you can make decisions. Like emotions are neither good nor bad, they just exist. And they shouldn't determine everything you do, and they shouldn't be ignored in what you decide to do. They're information for you to use in what you're deciding to do. And if you're looking at them head on, then you can notice, oh, this emotion is pushing me to do this thing, but that doesn't fit with my values or these other things that I know to be true. So I'm going to go in this direction instead. But if you don't even know it's pushing you in that direction, you're going to go and you're going to justify it to yourself as, oh, that's just the logical thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Come on. So we're about halfway through the episode. I want to make sure we've got quite a few more ideas to
Yeah,
play with
yeah.
here. The next one I want to fist bump here is in verse 9. I don't know where to begin in reading this on the
That's
air.
a long sentence, isn't it?
It's a very long
Uh,
sentence.
it starts back
Uh,
in verse 6, it looks like.
oh, sweet Lord. Um,
Yeah, let's just go 6 through
see the
10.
yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
and the punchline we want to acknowledge is in 9, repaying oppression and lack of resources. So
Hmm.
building to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. God will repay each person based on their actions. On the one hand, repaying age-long life to those who seek renown and honor and imperishability that's based on enduring in actions that benefit others. But on the other hand, repaying anger and indignation to those who both refuse to be persuaded by the truth because of competitive self-promotion and are also persuaded to injustice, repaying oppression and lack of resources to each human being who performs harm, both Jew first, then also Greeks, but repaying renown and honor and peace for each person who performs generosity, both Jews first, and then also Greeks. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Yeah. Now usually that I'm glad we read the whole thing there. Uh Usually verse 9 there is something to the effect of repaying like anguish and
Mm-hmm.
hardship or something to that effect.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So when you're reading this passage
So
in
you
yeah,
can
bring it in.
even put it up here. Yeah. So yeah, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good. Oh wait, yeah, there will be affliction and distress on everyone who does evil, on the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, for the Jew first and also for the Greek.
Yeah. Yep. Now it's worth acknowledging, first of all, you're not just choosing um, leftist language here, oppression and lack of resources.
Right,
It's
right,
literally in like the list of synonyms in like the academic
right, right.
documents that you're using.
Yeah, I'm not making stuff up here.
No. And to draw out that contrast, like when you hear this passage as like the judgment of God and we're all turds and
Hmm.
you get to this point where it's repaying anguish and distress. Um, we're already hearing it through the lens of heaven and hell and a
Hmm.
punitive judgment of God instead of a restorative judgment of God.
Right.
And so it was already worth saying, well, hang on. That's the wrong story. let's see what other words there are. And then when you find that these words are faithful to the text,
Yeah, yeah,
not just the big picture, but to the specific words being used by St. Paul, repaying
right.
oppression and
Yeah,
lack of resources.
yeah. There are kind of two groupings of definitions for the word there.
Yeah.
A more physical definition, narrowness of space, lack of room, cramped quarters, or a more experiential definition of financial straits or lack of resources. Those are listed in the dictionary. I did not make this up.
Yeah. Yeah. It it pairs well with kind of the list of behaviors as well. There's a almost a karma or maybe more natural consequences parenting style here of um, whatever chapter in human consciousness and experience Paul is describing here. It seems to be something after our death that also happens in this life as well. um, it seems to be fundamentally purgatory, this idea that they're between death and whatever happens, whatever the final state is,
Yeah, it's a
resurrection, with God, whatever.
transformation.
Yeah, yeah. There's a transformative experience here where it's not just like aha, and now the imps are going to jab you with pitchforks, or you're going to be tortured, or all these things.
Mm,
It's like the experience you'll have will be the experience you doled out to others.
yep. And why? Because that was the kind of world you were creating. So that's the kind of thing that happened to people who live in that world that you created.
You reap what you sow
Hmm.
on the far side of things. And the sense I make of that is you're not stuck there. It's meant to like awaken, jolt you into action, to join the prayers of the children of Israel stuck in slavery in Egypt as they cry out to Yahweh for their own liberation and
Hmm.
raging against the Egyptian machine of injustice and brickmaking, and
Yeah.
saying, I want to cross that sea of reeds and be free to
Hmm.
enter the heavenly whatever the hell, whatever the heaven we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, it
It's
just
yeah,
sorry, it just occurred to me that like Moses is the like the type of like the narrative of this, right? He was the prince of Egypt, part of the oppressors, became the oppressed, and then that transformed him to become a liberator for the people.
yes, yeah. So this is you will have your long sojourn that will hopefully jolt you into that repentance and desire for flourishing for all, for a belonging
Hmm.
and abundance for all. But what that purgatory experience is like is reaping what you sowed, which
Hmm.
is sobering, but also like
It's
way better
hard.
than just
Yeah.
arbitrary punishment. And then God abuses you forever.
Hmm.
That's irrational. So,
Right.
okay, let's keep
Remember, we
going.
don't do things by rationality. We do it by emotions, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, well done. And just on the note of the because you shifted good in verse 10 to generosity,
Hmm.
that pairs really nicely with the kind of economic and material um intention of here. It's not following rules.
Right. Yeah, the
Um,
Greek word there is not ever about following rules. Whenever you see doing good in the Bible, it is implying good for others, benefiting others, doing something that's kind and giving toward others.
yes. Yes. Um, thank you. And that brings us to these like three ideas that we want to acknowledge here that we don't have time for, but we will have time elsewhere. And the first one is um, you've replaced where it is typically law, you have put Torah,
Mm-hmm.
And that sense
Yeah.
of law is often used, particularly by those who like to abuse others with this letter. Um,
Mm-hmm.
law is understood as like there is this kind of cosmic baseline law energy by it is God's law, God's plumb line of rule breaking and rule keeping by which God will righteously judge you and righteously damn you. No one can
Mm-hmm.
live up to the requirements of that law. There's a big problem with that. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
talking about the Torah, because again, this is about
Mm-hmm.
racial, cross-cultural belonging. He's
Right.
talking
Yeah,
about
it's
Jews and Gentiles.
right. Yeah. And not only is Torah lowercase t not the same thing as a rule, it's more instruction, guidance. Uh, guidance. I like that. That might actually be the best translation for it.
That's good. Yeah.
Um, but Torah uppercase T, it's actually specifically talking about that collection of documents: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what it's referring to here.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And we
And
want
being the
to,
carekeepers, the caretakers, the ones who received those documents, carry on those documents, share those documents, there is a
mm-hmm.
sense of identity in that for Jews, and that's what it's addressing here. Is that identity is we're the ones who have this meaningful?
Yeah.
And there's different ways to answer that question. Is it meaningful?
Yeah. Yeah. So if, to read a sample um verse here, like I'll read it with law and then you read it with Torah. Verse 12. You see,
Okay.
as many as deviated without the law will also bring ruin on themselves without the law. And as many as deviated with Torah with it's as many as deviated with the law will be judged by means of the law. Uh
Yeah. You see, as many as deviated without Torah will also bring ruin on themselves without Torah. And as many as deviated with Torah will be judged by means of Torah.
yeah, like just this idea of a big holy law that hits people. It's de-Judaizing it. It's de-interpersonalizing
Right.
it.
Hmm.
And it's adding this layer of how God can relate to reality. It makes God subservient to it. Um, that is just
Mm-hmm.
false. It's not there. It's fundamentally talking about a sacred document that has a rich and responsibility enhancing role in a community
Mm-hmm.
and to individuals. The
Yeah.
second word there we've already read now twice: deviated, deviations instead of sin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a good pairing here, having it be with Torah. Um, Deviation, it's is moving off the appropriate trajectory, right? The right direction that you're supposed to be moving in. And that's what hamartia means. It's an archery term that's like the arrow missed the mark, but it went off course, right? And the course is lowercase t Torah is the direction set out, get that guidance. The verb form is to shoot an arrow. Um, and set that direction. So that's what so Torah isn't law, isn't a set of rules, and hamartia, sin, deviation is not breaking rules.
Yeah,
It's living, moving in a way that misses the point, that's not following the guidance set forward of how we build a better world and a better life for all of us.
And the last phrase that we'll spend more time on later, boy, will we, is what it does it show up that much in this passage, but just usually righteousness, justice, and justification. Those words are starting to
Mhm.
show up if you're reading other translations, and
Yeah,
boy, entire
yeah,
systematics are built around them.
yeah, yeah. They're in verse they consider aligned as being made righteous, typically, or something along those lines. And again, this is another word that fits in this theme of the trajectory set out. It right means like straight, aligned. Righteous is aligned with the path that's traced out by Torah.
Yeah,
Um, so you can deviate or you can stay aligned with it. Those are kind of the two
yeah, yeah,
alternatives, right?
yeah, yeah. And the way that we each kind of translate is a bit distinct on this one. You're very good at finding these kind of patterned metaphors within the text and
Hmm.
bringing those to the surface, which is spectacular. I tend to lean more into the kind of thematic and narrative of it. And so like what I do usually for that be righteousness or made righteous is something along the lines of to have holy belonging, to be found
Hmm.
in the sacred tri you know communion of God with others.
Yeah, which is more about an affirming something that's already true in my mind. So maybe it's part of my resistance to doing that because I don't think you gain the belonging by being aligned. Yeah, it's more of I see it as maybe the other way around. Being aligned is affirming the belonging that you already have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Everything already belongs. It's just a matter of participating in that belonging.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but it gets at a certain sense of both the deepest belonging in the heart and life of God that we all
Hmm.
already have,
Hmm.
not because of anything we do, but because of the love of God. And it's getting at this question of that Greek word was used, and people who've been formative to us around New Testament stuff like N.T. Wright really lean into the sense of like righteousness language is actually it's also a horizontal word, and it's not necessarily a
Right.
personal word. It's a way of saying who's in and who's out.
Hmm.
By what means shall we know who's in and who's out? Is it circumcision? Is it
Right,
Sabbath? Is it um, on down the line?
right. Is it speaking in tongues? Is it
Yeah, taking communion. Is it
you?
like
Is it using the word liberation instead of salvation?
there you
Is
go?
it
Yeah,
whatever? All right.
yeah, um, yeah. A theme really that I feel particularly really throughout Romans, but this early part is so much of like Torah is a really good, important thing that in election being the particular people with whom God will tell the story of cosmic infolding. Um,
Mhm.
you get to the universal through the particular, not the other way around. Paul is really trying to make it clear, like it's really hard not to weaponize that. Do
Mhm.
not weaponize it. It sucks. And
Yeah.
that's what he's getting. And he's like, look, I'll even just like, yeah, from circumcision to the law to or to the Torah, excuse me.
Come on, Brandon.
Yeah, yeah. But and that the reason I want to say that is that it really is consequential to the modes of articulating who belongs that we find in our own life.
Hmm.
Whether you're part of um, no congregation, an intentional community, a denomination, you're part of the Roman Church, whatever it is, there are these written and unwritten terms of belonging, terms of identity articulation that become conditions
Yeah.
for belonging. In terms of
Right.
identity, articulations of identity,
It's a mouthful.
we can't not have.
Right.
Um, and it's really hard on everyone when you make that into a term of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
The only term is, are you working for the liberation of one another? And are you recalcitrantly resisting that? That seems to be
Yeah.
about it. Paul does say, like, okay, some of you just need to F off
That's
for a bit,
that's
but
the basic. That's the foundational concept. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, let's see. So those are the big three. We'll get to more and more later. Um, okay, let's end on this last one here, verse 18.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. I'll start
go
with
ahead.
17 as we everyone read this. Yeah. However, if you name yourself as Jewish and rely on Torah and boast about your connection with God and being informed because of Torah, you know the intention and approve the things that matter, and you're convinced that you yourself are a guide for those who don't see, a light for those who are in darkness, an instructor for the unwise, a teacher for little children, since you have the framework of the knowledge and the truth in Torah, then as you teach someone else, don't you teach yourself?
So the first, thank you. The first I want to lean into here is, um, you know the intention and approve the things that matter. Now, I'm just going to read part of your footnote here. Traditionally, it's
Okay.
his will. However, there is no his in the Greek, and the word thelema means desire or intention or what is wanted and is used for humans and God and can be into. Okay, on it goes. Talk about bending
Yeah.
the note.
Yeah. Yeah. I intend to drink a drink of water because I'm thirsty. I want some water. I want to pursue a career in counseling. I want to translate the Bible. I want world peace. Like it could be as big or as small. It doesn't matter. That's like I want this, or I tend to do this, or I tend for this thing. Like that's the meaning. It's not a theological technical term that you find in a systematic theology text about God's will.
Yeah, yeah. And being informed because of the law, you know that the will of God, and it's like God's will language is it's like some sort of like ultimate trump card to use to just like clobber people. And it
Hmm.
also opens us up into a world of meticulous sovereignty or providence, where all things are meticulously controlled and ordained by God, including whether you're being eternal bliss or eternal torment. Um, and they are just shoehorning that in there. Like, of course, like God has a meticulous. Yeah, I
Hmm.
was stunned to see. I would have passed right by that if you hadn't even put a footnote there, and then to realize, no, they're putting God's will in there. What the hell is that doing there?
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I clearly have some soreness about how people and grief around how people carry
Hmm.
individually and upon one another ideas of God's will. God wills
Yeah.
shalom with you with all things. Don't
Hmm.
get too much. God wills Christ, in other words. Don't get more
Yeah.
freaky. Don't get creepier than that.
Yeah. God's intention is love.
Yeah, it's love. Yeah, all the way down. Well, I think we got to end it there. We're gonna continue on in chapter 3. Be sure to read that. Read in your Bible in Romans chapter 3 for next time. Actually, don't read in your Bible. Read in Brandon's Bible.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll share.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or review on whatever app or player you've been enjoying this on, particularly if that's YouTube or Apple Podcasts. That makes it easier for more people to find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. The Google Doc, and probably by the time this is live, website and PDF of Romans is in the episode notes. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads at Old Song New Dance and read more of his work at oldsongnewdance.com. You can follow me on Threads as at BD Rhodes. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.